welcome to this next window in the 2022 TooFatLardies Advent Calendar. And it's December the 15th, and the question behind the next window is, how have the armies or forces used in your war games changed in size over the years, and why? So this question is a bit of a travelogue, really. It is for me, and it may be for you as well, because it's really about the type of games that I've played over the years. And we probably start right back in the 1980s, like another couple of windows in this particular Advent calendar have started in the 1980s. And got a great illustration that I remember going to the Derby War Games show in the United Kingdom, probably around about 1990, 1991. And I remember seeing an amazing game of the 1704 assault on the Schellenberg Heights by the Duke of Marlborough in 28mm using War Games Foundry figures. And this was an amazingly beautiful game, just hundreds and hundreds of figures arrayed in regiments as the British and their allies tramped up the hill to confront the French and Bavarian defenders on the Schellenberg Heights. And it was a game that unrolled over the course of a Saturday and I think into the Sunday, because the Derby show was over 2 days in those days. And it really looked fantastic. And as I was watching that, I was also at the same time starting to build up my own forces for the late 17th century. And I thought to myself, this is what wargaming should be like. It was just in my period. It looked fantastic. The figures looked terrific. And this was the sort of wargame I always wanted. And I thought to myself as a kind of young guy, this is where I want to get to in my hobby. I want to have these games on tables in my own home and have friends round and have whole weekends of gaming. And in a way, the next sort of 10 or so years, I started building up large collections of figures in different periods, large regiments, big terrain, always with the intention of having a large table and a immersive, huge battle being played on it. And I think in other wargaming Advent windows over the years, I've mentioned that a favourite game would be a table which is groaning with the weight of Renaissance figures and expansive sweeps of cavalry and star forts at the corners of the table and lots of terrain. And I think in a lot of ways that's really a wargaming dream. It's certainly something which I've been privileged to take part in, games where I've contributed figures and had really big games. So at Lard Island, some of the really memorable games have been big games. They've been like the Trafalgar refight we did in 2005, or the Waterloo refight that we did in 2015. Really big, immersive games. Some of the World War II games as well. I can remember an amazing game we did of Stalingrad, and also another one of Tobruk. Really big games and multiple tables, lots of people coming over. And certainly the armies that I built up in the 80s and the 90s and even into the 2000s were really framed around those types of engagements. Lots of figures, multiple regiments, significant outlays of expense and time in painting and creating. And lots of very big bulky terrain items and baseboards. But also as time has gone on, my work's got a lot more busy, my family's grown, and also the appetite for carrying and moving all of these figures and terrain and baseboards has slightly eroded. And I can probably see a few of you smiling because you may have had the same experience. The time that I have for wargaming seems to have shrunk at this stage in my life. And also the appetite for those big games is probably not the same as I used to have. And really about 10 years ago, I came to the conclusion that I wanted to start thinking, as well as doing still the big battalions and the impressive large terrain, I wanted to do smaller, more portable games that I could take round to shows, I could take to people's houses or the club in an evening. And really the first version of thinking through those aspects was Dex Brutariarum, where the armies of the Saxons and the Jutes that I built were really quite much smaller than what I'd previously been doing for the First World War. and then the armies that are framed around the 30 Years' War, which I built in 2mm scale. They were significantly smaller as regards an outlay of time and expense and size. And both the Swedish and the Imperial Army, though they're significant as regards the units depicted, they fit in an A4 box file together, delineated by various different shelves within that box file. It's a very different experience carrying that round to multiple travel cases of Wargames figures in 28mm. So practicality and portability were certainly two aspects that have been in my mind over the last few years. There's also another aspect which possibly doesn't get spoken about so much, and this is something that in lockdown I really realised that the smaller the game, the easier it is just to bring out and play. The games that we built of Flashing Blades, the Musketeers version, and also the games that we've been playing of the Japanese variant of Flashing Blades. We've played those a lot, really 25, 30 times we've played Flashing Blades now, and up to almost a dozen of the Japanese version. And that's because those games are really portable. You can take them around to Wargame shows and bring them out and play 2 or 3 games during the course of a day. It's much easier to get a game and much easier to set up and put that game away than it would have been a very large game involving lots of different regiments of figures, ships, large-scale terrain. So my armies and forces being used in war games have really shrunk in size over the years. Partly practicality, partly to try and get more games completed and more games on the table after the first set of games have been completed. And I've really enjoyed that experience. I think the saddest thing sometimes is painting war games figures that never see the table. I'm sure all of us have probably had that experience that we've painted a regiment or maybe even an army and it just hasn't seen the table very many times. And one of the things that I was determined to do during lockdown was play more games. And that really meant thinking about how I was going to try and play the games that I wanted to play as much as possible. How do I get more games per hour of painting? And a smaller game for me achieved that. And then it was a question of how do I build into a smaller game all the things that I loved and still love about large-scale games, large-scale battle wargaming. And I guess the other part of the question behind the window is how might the scale of the armies and forces used in my war games continue to change over the years? Well, that's a crystal ball question, which isn't really an Advent question. But that will be really interesting because I might have more time when the kids have all left home to go back to the days that we decided the fate of kingdoms and whole nation states on the basis of a weekend of wargaming, all in 28mm moving across the table. That's quite possible, but I think until that time, I'm going to be happy with my smaller scale engagements, which may not decide the fate of kingdoms, but certainly can be cracking good fun and are very portable.